Welcome to our latest discussion on COP26. This discussion series is on the theme of the big picture, and I'm joined today by a couple of other people for what I hope will be a stimulating conversation. Throughout the year, we have tried to have a narrative arc to our work in the lead up to COP26, and the IES has been leading 6 discussions based around the acronym STAGES. The acronym stands for Sustainability, Transformation, Adaptation, Green Society, Economy, and Solutions. This is the concluding episode in that, and we're now very firmly in the solution space. I think environmentalists at times can be guilty of dwelling in problem identification too long, and now is very much the time for climate action. If we have any hope of hitting our climate targets, we need to start talking about the science, social impacts, and politics of solutions. So today's theme is about those solutions, asking how we can most effectively fight climate change. And I think today's conversation is going to be an expansive one, drawing together all the ideas, challenges, and topics discussed since this work began back in December 2020. In particular, we want to focus on the importance of science-based targets, evidence-led policy, and systems thinking. And these all need to be at the centre of our approach to finding solutions. In order to bring these conversations together in a format aligned with COP26, which from today will be starting in 9 days' time. What we're doing is we're basing these discussions in October around the 5 presidential themes of nature, clean transport, energy transitions, adaptation and resilience, and finance. Today's discussion is an added extra to those, and the topic is the big picture. And we will try to draw together a number of threads from the work that we've done over the past year. I'm joined today by 3 environmental experts, Professor Liz Price, Professor Kathryn Monk, and Dan Carpenter for a facilitated discussion of around 90 minutes on the big picture theme. Together, we have a good representation from academia, arm's length bodies, NGOs, and environmental consultancy. We'll be recording this episode for YouTube, so I'm going to ask each attendee just to give a 30-second introduction to themselves, so that when people are watching the recordings, they know who they are listening to. So I'll begin with myself. My name's Adam Donnan. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institution of Environmental Sciences. I've worked for the organisation for about 15 years in various roles, and have been the CEO since 2013. I also am currently the chair of the Science Council, which is an umbrella organisation that represents about 40 scientific professional bodies and learned societies across the UK. So Liz, if you want to start off with your introduction.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everybody. So my name is Liz. I'm Liz Price, and I am the chair of Chairs, which is the Education Committee of the Institution of Environmental Sciences. I'm also Professor of Environmental Education at Manchester Metropolitan University, an academic lead for the environment. And I'm particularly interested in accelerating education for sustainable development, carbon literacy, and net zero skills to support the green transition. Thanks, Adam.
And Dan.
Hello, I'm Dan Carpenter. I'm Associate Director for Strategy and Policy at Ethos Environmental Planning. Ethos is an environmental consultancy. We principally work in ecology, green space, and other related areas across the spectrum of the development process, from developer through local planning authority and landowner. My particular interest is twofold: one in net gain and wider environmental net gain solutions and how that fits in with this conversation, and also I have particular interest in data and the use of data in science and evidence-based decision making.
Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Kathryn Monk. I'm now actually an independent advisor and non-exec director. I've just finished a long career with the UK government agencies, leading on science and evidence. And that was built on an equally long time working overseas on a wide range of quite innovative programs to deliver conservation, forestry, and environmental good practice. So I'm an ecologist, and I suppose related to this meeting particularly, I'm the chair of a a charity called the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which seeks to ensure really rigorous evidence-based decision-making using the best methodologies, which are around systematic reviews. And I also am involved in a number of local activities now on the ground climate change action. Thank you.
Excellent. So the aim today is to have quite a relaxed discussion where we'll cover a number of topics. And because it's themed around the big picture, it will at times remain quite theoretical and quite kind of meta in its approach, and philosophical, I guess. And I think that's totally fine. You know, that's where we want this one to be. So we kicked off this whole series with the first theme being sustainability, and what we were concerned about when we were thinking about this is about the relationship between greenhouse gas management and a broader set of environmental goals. A few years ago, the kind of dominant mental model for the sector was all about the SDGs, and we were kind of wrestling with the complexity of a wide set of 190 targets, and thinking about how we could balance all of those and stop people just kind of cherry picking the odd one out. And it seems now very much that what's dominating our thoughts is net zero and the climate emergency, sometimes with the ecological emergency tagged on. And there is a scenario that provides a somewhat dystopian halfway house, the scenario called clean but not green. And I wanted to ask you guys if you felt that that was a real danger, and if it was or wasn't, how do we go about achieving multiple co-benefits from climate goals? And if we are forced to make trade-offs between climate action and other environmental priorities, you know, how do we go about doing that? So a few nods around the room. I know it's a tricky first topic to get your teeth into, but if I start with you, Kathryn.
Yes, well, nothing like starting right in the middle of the big problem, is there? I suppose what I took particularly when you were speaking was the sort of differentiation, I know is not absolute, between the climate emergency and the nature crisis. And I think there is a large group of people who now do not differentiate between those two. And in fact, do not differentiate between climate emergency, nature crisis, and unsustainable consumption and production. They are all part and parcel. And quite honestly, from my perspective, the unsustainable production and consumption is the root cause. So it is very difficult. I was actually mapping out for myself my perspective, my world, and what I thought of all the things that were going on for COP, because it's so massive now, and thinking, well, what's happening at a global level, what's happening at a national level, what's happening in the universities, what's happening in local government, what am I doing? And it is, I suppose I could be trite and say, it's basically we all need to change the way we live. And there are, I think, a lot of things that we can all do individually. But I do think that from the nature crisis, we've got a very good model drawing on the ecosystem approach, which came through from CBD many years, well, obviously many years ago, but is gradually taking force. That the government, our government, it is embracing to various extents, and that unfortunately is seen as something to deliver just on the environment. But the methodology and the approach is actually applicable for all of it. Now, it's not that exactly easy, but it is all about looking at the whole system, putting your boundaries in, looking at the multiple options of interventions, and deciding where the most critical action is needed. Now that sort of sounds easy. I know it's not, but I think that element where we do all have to take the systems approach that you mentioned, absolutely, and get used to assessing the value, and I say value in the most broad term before anybody listening eventually goes mad on financial valuation, the broad value of the interventions and their consequences. And I think the main thing of all that is we must look at the multiple consequences of our interventions with whatever valuation system we use. Hope that helps to start us off.
Yes, so it's a question of whether in application that is always the case, isn't it? That we have got very used to a language of trade-offs, I think, within the environment sector, and it tends to kind of go back to that old sustainability model of thinking about the 3 pillars, and hopefully, thought has moved on a little bit from that into something a little more complex about codependencies. But I don't think we can entirely deny that there will be occasions where trade-offs do exist between an acceleration of carbon management policies or a slower movement on some of those that considers a broader set of environmental goals. And I think it's a big question for us as a environment profession about which pathway we're heading down. I certainly have my preference, but I'm interested to hear Liz and Dan's thoughts about how we might resolve some of those potential tensions if they do exist.
I think following on from Kathryn's comments and your comments, Adam, I think taking a systems approach is absolutely essential, because we would be really missing some significant opportunities if we didn't. And I think there's a big element of social justice in this, and making sure that the decisions that are made are really well informed from all of those aspects. And I know, environmental, economic and social are fairly simplified, but we really have to think about all of those together. And with imagination and ability and sort of a bit of inspiration and working together, I really do think we can. We do quite a lot of work with the Manchester Climate Change Partnership in Manchester, who are really interested in looking at how all sectors of society can benefit from this change to a green transition. And equally, we had a really interesting conversation with colleagues from the World Food Programme earlier this week, who are really concerned with how different countries can equally benefit from this green transition and not sort of suffering at the hands of it, because clearly, obviously, we know that the people most impacted are the people who have had least to do with causing some of these issues. So I think it's actually up to us to make a stand to do those things, because if we don't, who is? I think that's a really important part of our role. And I think the work that Dan and Kathryn do on data-informed solutions is incredibly important. I think evidence-based solutions that consider all the components are really what we are here for and what we should be doing. And that's I know it sort of sounds a bit like utopia, but I think that's what we're here for, and that's our job, and that's a challenge, but challenges are exciting, aren't they? And this is a really important challenge. So what a better way to use our skills and knowledge and abilities and work together to address those challenges, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on your point, Liz, there about equity, and I think that's really one of the most important things for me. Is actually, here in the UK we have a climate legacy, and we can't ignore that. And it's really important that when we are considering trade-offs, that how equitable they are is something we really need to think about. And that for me is one of those key decision points when it comes to deciding on one intervention or the other, is who actually benefits most. How, what's the widest possible range of beneficiaries for any particular intervention that you might choose. And sometimes that might mean you're actually the carbon benefits from it might be lesser, but the sort of wider environmental benefits and the sort of social and well-being benefits are much greater. And that, I think, is one of probably the most important things. And yeah, I think this all comes back to that systems point that you've all made already. We need to be thinking in systems terms, and those systems have scale as well. And so while we might look at a local system, we need to think about how that nests within a sort of wider system and a global system as well. And that equity piece, I think, runs through all of that as well. So those trade-offs are going to be difficult, but we want to make sure, that we aren't leaving people behind or requiring those who have, as you said, have the least role in getting to where we are today, aren't taking on the greatest responsibility for solving the problem as well.
Yeah, and in the most recent IAS strategy, in the introduction to it very much focuses on the concept that society is going to have to go through a great transformation and a radical transformation over the next 30 years to retool our economy towards a low carbon economy and to kind of deal with those social justice issues at the same time. But if you look back in history, the analogous situation to that transformation is probably the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution left whole swathes of the country socially dislocated, politically dislocated, and huge upheaval. And we're very interested as an institution about how we can not make that same mistake again and bring people along in that transition. And I'm quite keen to hear your opinions about what may be some methods to avoid, stranded industries, to avoid negative reactions to some of the to change, as is always inevitable. I think people don't like change, or they've got limited tolerance for change. Sometimes they don't mind periods of disruption, as long as they can see the higher goal. And you kind of saw that, I think, over the last 18 months with COVID, that there was quite good cohesion around some of that radical transformation in the early days, but that cohesion kind of gradually eroded. And I don't think we're in the same situation now, 18 months on, as we were in the first 3 or 4 months as kind of a socially cohesive body. So I'm keen to hear about some kind of practical ideas around that social justice element and how we bring people along with us.
I don't mind going first again, but I'm not going to do that every time. And because also I feel I'll probably talk quite broadly rather than completely practically, Adam. That's sometimes my problem. However, I've had experience sort of on the ground in many different situations in the past, and I suppose we mentioned it before, partly about this approach, and I know I still use the ecosystem approach as a catch-all. I feel that it's a much broader approach, which has sort of become more embedded across a lot of our activities, and it's a tool for sustainable development, which does encapsulate that systems thinking. It also really underlines the value of interdisciplinarity. This sort of, a lot of the solutions that we're reading in the lead up to COP are science-led, technical innovation, and that's great. And I'm not, I'm arguing against that, but I think bringing together the disciplines, both the scientific disciplines as an interdisciplinary activity, but certainly across the social and economic and arts and humanities. I'm sorry, it makes life very complicated, but these are very complicated challenges, and they cannot be solved in our old-fashioned linear project management approaches. So interdisciplinarity, and that means bringing in many different, we'll say, stakeholders and others to bring those multiple perspectives in. It was nice to see in the net zero strategy at least one systems map, but I only saw one. I'm sure, and we all hope there are many behind it. And so I think that those are, so, you know, the ecosystem approach, the systems thinking, interdisciplinarity, and also that other sort of catch-all co-production. And we said before about bringing in these different communities, and it's not just local communities as citizens, but I think it is when you bring different businesses together, or when you bring different academics together, or across to it. All these approaches and techniques are really, really vital. And we don't give, I think, enough time to apply these approaches properly and effectively enough. And certainly, you know, my experience in government, I can say this now because I'm not there anymore, you know, being given 12 weeks to come up with a plan is not sensible. You cannot do it. Well, you can do it, but you will then waste far more than 12 weeks down the line rectifying the problems that you haven't recognised. So I don't want to be depressing, but that all those approaches are encapsulated in the 1999 Modern Government Review of how to apply policy making. And it's true. It's not just for policy making. I think it's for all our activities. It's those approaches which are really important, but we do need the time and we need the expertise to get that co-production, to get those conversations together. And that's, I think, Adam, where we'll start to be able to bring a sort of push from the bottom up. We have many examples already, and I don't want to sort of ramble, but, you know, neighbourhood climate action plans. It's amazing what local communities, and that's not being patronising, what they can come up with, and we don't rely on them enough, and we don't give the time, and we don't give the facilitation sort of expertise enough time to provide that, and then we pay for it because we have to keep changing our mind further down the line.
I think that's so important, isn't it? That whole idea of that whole co-production idea is absolutely vital. As you say, I mean, what local communities have done in certain locations is wonderful and couldn't have been achieved from that sort of top-down approach of you know, policymakers sitting in rooms and going, right, this is what we should do. You know, things like in my area, local flood resilience forums, who've done amazing work in terms of, you know, really understanding what the problem is and looking at what the solutions are that are going to work in their local area. And you're right, I don't think we give it enough time or enough credence sometimes, actually, that, you know, it's very easy as professionals who sort of know the nuts and bolts and the ins and outs of all of this stuff to just kind of go, well, we know what the answer is, so we'll just write something down. Actually, we have to really kind of take a step back and realize we probably don't know all the answers, and what we think we know might not necessarily work, not because of the scientific approach, because of that social approach. And so you're absolutely right, bringing in those people who have that real knowledge and understanding of those other things, those kind of sociological, you know, community-based practice that, you know, is not really a part of my personal practice, is vital for really kind of getting at and sort of being taken with a community to really kind of come up with solutions that are going to work for that group of people. And they're not going to be the same everywhere. I have no doubt that common themes will emerge, and a lot of the science that is out there will provide the solutions to in many of these cases. But it's no good, you know, dictating to people what the answer is. Actually, to be really successful at this and to really have fundamental transformative change, it needs to come from that process of really understanding what people's real concerns are and addressing those. And sometimes those concerns are much more fundamental than some of the things we're actually trying to solve. And if we can address that, then actually the other things will just kind of sort of fall down like a domino effect. They go, oh, well, we've sorted that out. Then it's not as much of a challenge to address some of the things that we might be concerned about as environmental scientists.
Thanks. Can I just add sort of some examples of some of the things that are going on that actually embrace all the principles that both Kathryn and Dan have talked about? So I'd like to talk about education for sustainable development, carbon literacy and net zero skills, if that's right, but I'll be as brief as I can. So I'm a real advocate of all three, and at Manchester Met we are embedding education for sustainable development across our curricula, and that really does depend on interdisciplinarity and co-creation, but also working with external partners to deliver solutions, so students are able to have the competencies and skills to sort of create and lead for a more sustainable future. And if anybody's interested, there's some fantastic guidance out there written by QAA and Advance HE on how to embed education for sustainable development across all curricula. I'd really encourage people to have a look at that, because we really do need to make a step change. I think the biggest impact universities have is not only in their research, but in their sphere of influence, and all those wonderful students that that are launched onto the world and can make a real positive difference. So that's a real tangible step, linking to the principles that Kathryn and Dan have talked about. But in terms of everybody getting involved and everybody buying into the agenda, we found that carbon literacy training is a really valuable tool. And the way that works, it gives a little bit of information about climate change science. It gives some sort of ideas about postcards from the future, what the future could look like. And it also asks people to make commitments. And the reason it works is because it's very participatory. There's a lot of co-creation going on, and people have enough information to make informed decisions. They feel empowered to make their own choices, and they also work as part of a community to do that. And a lot of the training that we deliver is very much peer-to-peer training as well. So that works incredibly well. And I think, you know, I'm really ambitious that we need to get this rolled out to as many people as possible across all sectors. So there's an ESRC Festival of Social Science coming up, and we're offering some free training for people working with young people if anybody's interested. But, you know, these programs are available for universities, for colleges, for local authorities, for all sorts of organisations, for businesses. So, you know, I would just urge everybody to get involved in that. And finally, the other thing that I think is really important is some of the net zero skills work that's been going on, working in partnership again with higher education sector, further education sector, private training providers and industry and local government, looking at the skills that are needed and working together to co-create a pipeline of skills so that we can train students of the future, the workforce of the future, but we can also upskill people already in work to facilitate that green transition. And one of the things that I was pleased to see with the sort of net zero strategy is all of these things are highlighted in there. What I'm really keen now to see is the commitments coming true, where they're talking about policy and action to actually implement these things, because without backing from government, industry is going to be very reluctant to invest. They won't know which technology to support. They won't know which training to support. And everybody has to work together to make this work. So those are three very practical examples of the kind of things that Kathryn and Dan have talked about happening now. The challenge is, as Adam suggested, is to roll them out everywhere so everybody is involved, that nobody's left behind, and we do it quickly enough to meet our needs for the new skills agenda.
I like that concept of postcards from the future. That's an interesting idea. I remember a report a number of years back now from Futera called Sell the Sizzle. I don't know if anyone remembered that. And they talked about when you're selling sausages, you don't talk about the ingredients. You just have the sound of them sizzling. And when we're selling environmental ideas to the populace, we quite often will just give them the ingredients. You know, talk about why things have to be done, as opposed to actually talking about that better future in which there's a whole set of co-benefits that fall out, you know, from taking action around certain things of clean air, clean water, better mental health, all of these things. And we're not very good at actually articulating what that future might look like. But the big challenge in that is that behavioral psychology tells you that people value something they have, even that they currently have, even if it's subpar, more than something they might have, but maybe better, because of the uncertainty of the pathway to that. So I think that's always a challenge that we have to get over, about giving assurance that future is realistic. just reacting to that last thing you said, Liz, when we think about education, we tend to think about young people and progressing through university or through technical education. But part of this transition inevitably is going to lead a whole set of stranded industries. And I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of lifelong skills and like retraining opportunities and where they might come from, and are like apprenticeships the best model for that, or is there some other mechanism that we might be able to retrain some of those individuals whose jobs may no longer exist and train them into new industries?
Yeah.
And then I guess the second question is about who pays for that.
Yeah, that's a great. Oh, well, I don't know about the second one. I'll think about that one. The first question, I think, yeah, that's incredibly important, and that's come out of our skills pipeline workshops that we've done with industry and local authorities and education providers. Is yes, clearly we need to reskill people already in work to support the green transition, and there are various ways of doing that. So apprenticeships are one, but upskilling, short courses, apprenticeships, there are a whole range of aspects to do that. And I think it's very much the approach that we've taken is to try and map out the skills that are needed with industry and look at the different skills that are needed. And then the next stage is we're going to be working with education providers to see who is best placed to do each of those things. So we're not working in competition, we're working collaboratively, and we're making sure that the skills are provided, but provided in the right way, by the right people, for the right people. Some of the challenges that employers have told us is that because they don't know which skills are yet needed, they need some support from their professional bodies in supporting that and driving that agenda. Because before the net zero skills policy strategy came out, it wasn't clear which sort of innovations government were going to back. And I think having that backing from government will be incredibly important to allow them to make those decisions, to actually invest in some of those changes. And then secondly, it's about having critical mass and having enough people who want to do the training and working collaboratively to design appropriate programs that can support the training needs in a meaningful way. And the only way that will happen is by this continued dialogue with education providers, industry, local government, national government, to make sure that we get it right. And I was interested to see in the net zero strategy that there are going to be some sort of guidance, some guidance is going to be issued, but I think a lot of people are kind of getting on and doing it anyway, but waiting for sort of the support of government to make sure that they're jumping in the right direction. So that it's worth their while investing. I think quite a lot of the funding may well come from industry, but a lot of it will have to come from other sources. And I know the government has invested in some of these schemes. So I think it's going to be a mixed diet of funding. But again, I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to drive this forward. And the enthusiasm we've had from everybody working with us has been wonderful. So we're really keen to progress this. And I think we just need to keep working together to make sure it happens and that the right providers deliver the right training to the right people, as I've outlined. So it's very much a work in progress. I don't know if that answers your question, Adam.
Yeah, and Dan, being on the coalface within an environmental consultancy, what do you think of that kind of skills challenge?
I think there's undeniably a challenge there for the sorts of work that we do. In some ways, I think that in some ways ecology is always seen as a desirable kind of industry or sector to get into, but maybe the skills that are present in the sector now are not the skills that we're going to need for the future. And so it goes back to this point about that systems thinking and rather than just being really good at identifying individual species, we've now got to think bigger and broader, and there's perhaps some of that lacking. But I don't, so how exactly, but again, as Liz was saying, it's knowing exactly what we're going to be doing that is kind of the stumbling block at the moment. It's like, well, what are we going to be doing in a few years' time, and where should we be focusing our efforts in that? And I think we've had some steer of that, around some of the sort of the net gain agenda and the sort of nature recovery network, and that provides us with some of the clues to that. And increasingly, those sort of digital skills are going to be really important in the future as well, and that's something that perhaps as a sector ecologists have not necessarily embraced widely, and so that is definitely a focus, I think, for the future. But that may be just my own interest coming to the fore there rather than a broader view. But it is going to be a challenge, and there will be new things that emerge, I think, out of that sort of net gain agenda that aren't quite yet predictable in terms of what we might need to be considering. But that sort of solid foundation in understanding ecosystems and how they function, and how you sort of measure and monitor that, and then communicate that more broadly, I think is an area that we are going to need to focus on, both in private sector and in the sort of public sector as well, I think.
And Kathryn, I know that you, like myself, are a strong supporter of technical education. Do you have any thoughts about its capacity to help in that transition?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was listening sort of closely, really interesting from both Liz and Dan, and then smiling when Dan sort of, sort of referred to what is often a perception, isn't it, Dan, of ecologists, if they're employed in government and in quite a lot of other situations, as they're focus on species and identifying species. And they sort of always drives me completely wild, because I actually think, I've said this a few times, maybe it sounds a bit trite, but this, I think we really are in the age of ecology. I've always thought ecology is about systems, it's about uncertainty, it's about being able to work within an uncertain environment. I'm just sort of from my early days sort of doing scientific expeditions in the middle of nowhere, in first of all deserts, and then in tropical forests, so real sort of of not knowing the system and not knowing the species, but having to try and develop some sort of understanding. And I think an ecological training, I'm not going to be silly and say everybody should just be trained as ecologists, but it's not a bad basis, because it does teach you about systems, about working in uncertainty, about managing technical data, numerical data. But ecology is no longer just from animal and plant sciences, is it? It's very firmly in geography, it's very firmly interdisciplinary. So I think that basically we just train everybody as ecologists, but more sensibly. I've been really interested in watching and trying to encourage in universities sort of underpinning everything, and I think, Liz, you probably know more than I do about this, of getting that message of sustainability across the institution, so that every discipline incorporates some awareness, some mapping of where that core subject is through to what sustainability means. And of course you can do it in absolutely every single subject, and some universities have done it really well, and others are sort of doing it ad hoc. And in terms of departments, I mean, engineering is a great one. A lot of engineering departments, really unsung heroes of getting that change in approach and understanding of the engineering community. And then going completely the opposite way, working with local communities, or starting to understand local communities in this country. And I feel slightly embarrassed as an individual citizen of how little attention I've paid to what's going on in my local community I live in one city. I've been working in a different country, from Bristol across to Wales, and previously around the world. But I have learned so much quite recently of how local people in the most dire situations have got that grasp of the consequences of what they are doing and how that affects a much wider system. Some of them may see how they can change that, but most can't. They can see why they shouldn't do something, but they're not yet seeing how they can avoid doing it. And that in itself is, I think, an incredible resource. I mean, terrible for some people, the way they're having to work and survive. But we don't, I think, draw on that community enough to understand the type of education, the type of access to training that really would make an incredible difference, both to individual lives, but collectively in certain communities, quite a major step forward in a more sustainable life. So it goes back to that sort of using co-production, doesn't it? That it's not just looking at, well, who can we train, but who can we learn from, and how together can we build up the skills we need. It sounds a little utopian, but I think there's a kernel of strong truth there.
And localism is always an interesting topic, and I think it's something that parties always seem to make noises about in opposition, and then when they come into power, do next to nothing about. And if initiatives that are about localism always seem to fall down on the finance side, that they'll devolve responsibility, but not the finances to support that responsibility. And we've certainly at the IES found the same thing, that there's a great deal of incredible action happening at local level on a shoestring budget. And I guess, yeah, it's an interesting question. The transition, is it centrally led, or is it something that a million flowers flourish in different ways around the country, and that adds up to a total that's greater than if central government was trying to lead on something?
If I just carry on, sorry, Dan, if that's okay, because it sort of hits something which I've tried to practice myself for a very long time. And we've had that type of conversation, I'm thinking maybe 10, 12 years ago. I remember sort of having a bit of in a large sort of planning program for research funding. And, well, where should we put the funding? And the government doesn't do this, and the government doesn't do that, and we've got to change the government. And I got a little frustrated at that and said, well, have you told your MP then? And not one of them had ever spoken to their MP. And I'm not going to say here, do you all badger your MP? But it's not a bad idea. There are surprising changes if we do try and I don't mean sign the latest petition that's going around by whoever it might be to change something in COP, but because that can help, but it is a sort of standardized, regimented thing, and quite often people won't notice it. But that local contact with MPs, the MPs will ask questions to ministers if you give them that prompt, and bringing together community, locally at the other end, together to articulate issues and discuss them with local MPs and councillors. We often feel that that's not going to make any difference. But again, like you said, a million flowers, if nobody speaks to their MP, nothing will happen. We if we don't speak to, if we do speak to them, at least we can try and learn the best ways to support them and help them really deliver on all those fronts and not just on the easy ones.
Yeah, I agree, Kathryn, and I am one of those people who badgers my MP about various things. So yeah, it is important, but also at that local level, at the local authority level, it's equally important to talk to your local representatives as well, because in a lot of cases, actually, it's at that level that real change can happen, that people can actually see how it affects their lives, because Parliament operates at a slightly different timescale, doesn't it? And it takes a lot longer for things to happen there. Whereas locally, sometimes things can happen much more quickly if you engage properly with those local representatives. And I find this often with the local plan process, for example, when a council is putting together a local plan and local people aren't particularly engaged in it because it's a big document, it's very complicated, and it's not very interesting for them. But then when it comes to the individual development that they don't like, they wonder why they don't have a leg to stand on in terms of objecting to it. It's because they missed the boat in terms of having that conversation earlier on in the process. So local government and national government is very complicated, but I think, being able to understand those processes and where you can, as an individual or as a community, have influence over them is really important. And I think that's something that that we need to think about in terms of influencing the sorts of decisions that are made around the environment and then anything else, indeed, where where understanding where you can have a real influence on the decisions that are made, and doing that as early as possible in the processes that are kind of quite formulaic, to kind of get the change you want to see. And I think there's a real opportunity there. Again, talking about localism and influencing local decisions and local decision makers, to get the sort of outcomes that we really want to see. And it's something that I have often been frustrated by, and not quite sure how to go about addressing, but I still think it's a very important thing that we try and do there.
Yeah, I'd agree that it's both. So I think local action is really important because local people, local authorities know their home patch the best. They know what will work. They know what is important to their local communities. And I think we're lucky in Manchester, we've got the Manchester Climate Change Partnership, and we also work very closely with Greater Manchester through the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And I think that those local agendas are really important. So, we've been trying to push through targets and policies at a sort of city and greater Manchester area. And I think that's really important and really powerful. And again, very much, as we've all talked about, through a process of co-creation, because that includes things like resilience, where, as you've highlighted, it's not the experts who always have all the answers, and it's very much about speaking to local people about what they think the answers should be and what's important to them, and having messages that resonate for them, because if you have people who are worried about where their next meal is going to come from, the messaging has to be entirely appropriate to them. But equally, I think there does need to be leadership from national government to back some of the bigger policies, so that local authorities and industry know which policies that they should follow and which horse they should back, for instance. But also there are some agendas that are sort of national. So if you think about aviation budgets, we have carbon budget for Manchester, but what we're hoping is that the government will set a carbon budget for aviation, because if you're not careful, people will just sort of fly elsewhere if there are really strict budgets for one particular airport and nobody else is sticking to them. And it's sort of analogous to the idea of, what we want is innovation. We don't want people pushing their carbon onto somebody else. And so I think for things like that, you do need national input from national government. And that's why we need international agreement at the COP. Because otherwise people are just going to be passing their carbon around to other people, and we won't get a net reduction. So I think it's, sorry, Adam, as with all your questions, the answer is a bit of both.
I think it's really interesting, Liz, what you just said there about, because haven't we? We've been talking very much sort of local and then national and international, and it's almost inevitable that whenever we you know, it's that think globally, act locally, isn't it? All the time, think globally, act locally, and that's been around since Rio. It's a bit frustrating that we still don't get it right, but you know, it's a good thing to remind people, and I think it's a whole new generation that are picking up that sort of reminder. But I wonder sort of what, you know, when we have these conversations locally, and I in Manchester, trying to do the right thing sort of about its carbon emissions, and recognizing that what it can do is it's got its own local or regional but that it needs to be set in a national and international setting, and different sort of targets. And that gives local people and local communities and structures the evidence to take to the national government and the international governments for those national and international frameworks, and saying, you know, we know what we want to do here, but we can't do it unless you sort it out in the framework. And that sort of local action in the global situation is something that we are always facing it in so many of these elements, but it's not actually articulated necessarily or recognized everywhere. I mean, one area where it is recognised, but we still don't seem to get through, perhaps for various vested interests, is in regulation, and you know, say green regulation for industries. You know, lots of industries, lots of businesses are trying to be very green. Some are very green. Others would like to be green but don't know what to do. Others would like to be green, but they're not going to do it unless everybody else is green. And the pressure and the demands for that national regulatory framework or you know, level playing field is really important. And that's something, I suppose, coming back, Adam, to IES, that, you know, people, it would be great if we had that type of information, so that as members we could take that out and use as influencing the decision makers.
It's sort of like that leading by example type thing, isn't it? It's about I think that's kind of how I see it. Is you've got to be able to demonstrate sort of willingness almost, but not just willingness, but actually that you've got an answer to some of these really complicated questions. And if you can demonstrate that A, you can do it, and B, that you're willing to do it, then maybe others will kind of take that as a sort of reassurance that they're not going alone, and okay, well, they can come with it. And that sort of, you know, sort of bottom up pressure on the national framework, as you were talking about, which I agree is absolutely essential, sort of means that national framework becomes almost unavoidable, because people are sort of getting together and saying, well, we can do it and we're going to do it, and you should sort of fall in line with that. And I think that happens a lot through the legislative process, whereby people, where kind of the weight of opinion is such that, well, we're going to do it whether you like it or not, sort of thing, and the legislation sort of kind of rushes to kind of try and keep up, and in some cases actually ends up being better as a result, because it is more challenging or more ambitious in what it's trying to achieve, because you can already see what is already achievable from those local examples. So yeah, I think that's really important, and we should try and use that local enthusiasm and willingness to act to drive that national approach.
I found as well, from looking at local action, that community groups are often one of the best vehicles for climate action, because inevitably at any layer of government there comes a cynical reaction from people that it's something being imposed upon them. You know, that I don't like my local authority, and it's typical of them to want to do that type of thing, or, you know, I didn't vote for this party and that they're imposing this on me. Whereas if it comes from the grassroots, there seems to be a greater kind of consent, because you know some of the individuals that are in it, and you think, oh, you know, Kathryn down the road, she's a friendly woman. I don't mind listening to her and what she's got to say, and I'm sure she's got the community's best interests at her heart. So I think, consent is always an interesting topic, and ways in which we can get that public consent around some of this transition is going to be vital, because trust and public buy-in, without those two things, I think we could be in a lot of trouble. Good. It would be very remiss of me with the people that we have in this discussion to not spend a significant amount of time talking about evidence-based or evidence-led solutions. And we are the Institution of Environmental Sciences, and our members come from a scientific and technical background. And what I wanted to maybe spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about is about how we embed science and evidence-based solutions in our approach to addressing climate change. What are the mechanisms for doing that?
I'll go first this time. I was thinking about this, and I think one of the most important things about this is around openness and transparency, so that we're doing our science in an open and transparent way, so that people can see what we're doing and how we reach the conclusions that we reach, and make and how decisions are made as a result of that. And that's not to say that I don't think we are already doing it, but I think we can always do better. And so having that sort of shared evidence-based, shared knowledge base, and the collaboration that can facilitate, I think, is absolutely vital, because one of the dangers is that you end up in this sort of siloed type world where you're beavering away doing your thing, going, hey, the answer's 12, and someone goes, well, actually I've got an answer and it's different to yours. And therefore being open and transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you've reached your conclusions is really important. And I think the solutions to the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, they've got to come from a place of shared endeavor. We can't, and shared values, I think, as well. We can't just sort of decide individually what the right answer is, as we've been talking about. We've been talking about that co-production thing and all the rest of it. And I think that's also true for the science that underpins that we need to work really hard at making sure that our science and our evidence and our data perhaps is there and open and able for people to see and use and kind of interrogate for themselves. And I think if we can do that and we can get better at that, then I think we will advance toward those solutions much more quickly.
And I would suggest that that's probably always going to be imperfect, in that the model that we run things through when we're talking about environmental justice is that things are transparent, fair, just, cause a minimum amount of disruption to people's lifestyles, are understandable, are free or low costs at the point of use. And if you run the vaccine, through that model, it ticks every single one of those boxes. But unfortunately, there's still a percentage of the population that reject that, and I think inevitably we're never going to get universal consent for things. So it will always be an imperfect model. Kathryn, this is your bread and butter. So interested to hear what you've got to say.
Oh, goodness, yes. Well, I'll start sort of perhaps reacting to what you've just there about, we won't talk about the vaccine issue per se, but this issue where one can feel all the rigorous, analytical, repeatable evidence is available, and we still find people won't believe us. And I think the key there is in the word believe, and it can be very strong scientific evidence, but if somebody has a belief, they're not going to take anything we say, and that's two extremes. But I think particularly in these complex global challenges that carry a lot of fear, a lot of people's assessment of evidence from many sources is very mixed in their own conscious and subconscious belief, as well as in objective, cold logical decision making, and we always have to remember that, and that. So when we talk about evidence-based decision making, you will have all noticed, we go from evidence-based to evidence-informed, then we have a discussion about what evidence means, and so on and so forth. I think what is interesting, trying to put something that we can grip on this, is in the latest document, the net zero strategy. I haven't read all of it, I have to say, at all, but one of the things I do on all these documents that come out now is I search for the word evidence, and there were 87 mentions of the word evidence in this paper, and there were 248 on innovation. And that's quite, and then of course I can do all the others as well. It gives you just a very first sense of things, and only 2 mentions of the word interdisciplinary. But in terms of evidence-based, I think there is an increasing awareness and use in government. We've been working on this for, well, certainly it wasn't, I didn't start it off, but it's certainly ever since I came back to the UK in 2003, I've been involved in increasingly complicated and sophisticated networks of collaboration between academics and government, and increasing practices of training academics to understand the policy culture, and trying to train the policy people to understand the academic. And we are a long way down the road. We have improved enormously, but we're obviously still not there. And the big issue, I think, for us, again, we go back, is the time. We really are we're always challenged in policy on time. But in the medical profession, there is the issue of time, but there's also the issue, if you make the wrong decision, somebody dies fairly quickly and fairly obviously. And so the medical sector have got a very strong evidence-based approach. In environmental sector, of course, when we make the wrong decision, it's a little bit more difficult quite often to have that direct thread or culpability, but there is that recognition, and we are trying to increase it. And so certainly from IES, I think it's the awareness of always pushing back when somebody says, I've got to have this report in 2 weeks' time, always pushing back if you've got to make a decision, or you're being forced to make a decision based on 1 or 2 scientific papers. We'll just be a bit trite. We rarely make a decision on 1 or 2 papers, but we often make a decision on a bit of a mixed bag. They're not normally objectively, systematically assessed. Very, very rarely in environmental field do we use systematic reviews, which is the bread and butter, thankfully, in salvation for medical research and decision making. And I think we really do have to improve on the way we use evidence. Of course, if we are in a corner, we're often in a corner, be we a consultant or a politician or whatever, we have to make the decision on the evidence that is available. And that's what we have to do. But I think where we are constantly failing when we make those decisions based on the evidence that we've got, given time and money constraints, is to articulate the risk and the consequences of doing that. So, certainly in my government agency life, I can't change it if the decision has to be made in 2 weeks' time or in 6 months' time. But what I have been able to do constantly, to better or less effect, is to say we must articulate the consequences of making the decision on the evidence we've got. And then that's fine, as it were. You know, if it's a 50-50 chance that this is going to work and we've got no alternative, so be it. But I think it's fair to share the burden of that with the constituents. And it's a pretty, you know, it's fair to on the burden. It's also fair on people to know that that policy or that action, that road, that you know, whatever it might be, what the risks are in different areas. And so it goes back to the systems approach of recognizing the consequences of the intervention and the risks around that. That has to sit, sorry to sort of carry on, but that has to sit in a culture of accepting failure and not immediately demanding the resignation of somebody because the action has gone through based on the evidence that was available. With that probability, it didn't work out. And unless we get used to adaptive management and learning by mistakes and building on it, you know, we're constantly shooting ourselves in the foot.
So you're almost asking for a more sophisticated understanding of both science and policy making from all actors within society, and a greater kind of generosity around it almost.
I think you could put it in those general terms. I think it's more something which we could introduce into school curricula and the universities, and that is a lot better understanding of risk and uncertainty. You know, what is the risk and uncertainty around making a decision based on the information, the evidence that I have? You know, as human beings, we're notoriously bad at understanding risk, and our behaviours are quite strange, and we're certainly appalling at understanding and reacting to risk if it's 30 years down the road. 30 years ago, the evidence was there. It wasn't certain. There was a lot of dispute in science, but we could have taken a precautionary approach. And certainly I know I was sort of saying, you know, to in various situations, we have to take climate change, sea level rise into account. And we would be in a lot better position if we had done incremental change slowly over the last 30 years. And that's in climate change. It's also in things like pensions. We knew we were going to have a pension crisis down the line, but it's so far down the line, people generally find it more difficult to take action which is affects them negatively now. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now, because although we're talking about 2030, of course, is not very far, 2025 or 2050, it's near enough now that we've got so much basic evidence for the climate change itself that people are more aware. But now we're faced with this era of choosing interventions, and we can become frozen or very nervous about which to choose, or that one's going to really hurt me, so I won't do that, but I will do this. And so the evidence in that context and the risk and uncertainty is really important.
And quite often in the environment field, things are always set up as you can do one thing or the other, and you can't do both of them. So, you know, the hydrogen electric debate, for example, it's like, well, we have to choose one of them, as opposed to a sensible approach might be, you know, trying something different on a local scale, you know, banning all gas boilers instead of maybe trying out some area where it's green gas being fed into a local area or something. So I think it's sometimes the way that we set up the debates ourselves as environmentalists.
Yeah. Yeah, can I just add to what Kathryn was saying and link to your question, if I may? So, yeah, I mean, we've actually got a hydrogen fuel cell innovation centre at Manchester Met, but we're very clear that hydrogen has a part to play and electric has a part to play, and they both have strengths in different scenarios. And I think getting to the point that Kathryn and you were talking about evidence-based, I think one of the things that we found helpful and we're hoping to do more of is actually start to showcase evidence-based innovation to different sectors, whether that's the public, whether that's industry, whether that's local government, whether that's national government, and show them things working in practice and show them the evidence base for that, and when it will work best in one scenario and when it might work best in another scenario. And I think we've also done some work on peatland restoration, which is crucial, obviously, as a nature-based solution. And again, we've taken that approach to have very practical solutions, implementing them, then showing them to people and using the evidence base, but also, you know, I'm a great believer of learning through heads, hands, heart. So the information, you have a go, but also you feel connected to that and you can see how it's going to relate to you. And I think those kind of scenarios are really important for pushing this agenda forward quickly, because it has to be evidence-based, but it also has to show people what their options are and let them make those informed decisions. And I was interested in what you said, Adam, although I don't want to mention about vaccination and stuff, but we talk about, there's a very nice anecdote that the World Wildlife Fund produced a while ago. You know, we know that I think it's 97% of climate scientists say climate change is real, but people don't believe it. And you talk, Kathryn, about believe. Whereas if you were going to drive over a bridge and 97% of engineers said that bridge wasn't safe, I don't think anybody would drive over it. And so it's really interesting about addressing people's beliefs and beliefs in evidence. So, but I think if you can show people, they can see it for themselves, and they can see the costs and benefits of each, it's a really valuable way forward.
I'm not sure I'd even drive over it if 97% said it was safe and 3% said it didn't. It wasn't. Dan, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I was just going to reflect on what Liz was saying there, and about options, and something you said earlier about trying to imagine what something's going to be like, you know, a long time in the future, and sort of, you know, postcards from the future idea. I think that's one of the things that's really hard to do, is to try and articulate clearly how different scenarios or different options fit into a picture of what the future might be like. And this is something that I've wrestled with in a sort of you know, around woodland creation and woodland as a potential natural solution, nature-based solution for carbon. And people go, oh well, we just need to plant lots of woodlands, and actually understanding how that changes a landscape or an ecosystem is quite hard to visualize, because it takes such a long time that most people probably won't be there to see the outcome of that particular intervention. And that kind of sort of visualization almost of what the future could look like and how these different options fit in, I think is one of the real challenges that we kind of need to grapple with, so people understand, well, we can do that, we can do this, how does it fit into the bigger scheme, and what might that actually look like in the 30 years time, the horizon that we're sort of concerned with. And I think that's a real challenge, because some of it is quite theoretical, and we don't actually really know what the answer is. So we have to sort of imagine a little bit. We have to kind of you know, sort of paint a picture almost of what that's going to look like. And that's, again, that comes back to that interdisciplinary co-production type stuff we were talking about earlier, that sometimes as scientists we might need other people to come and help us with what that future looks like and what that vision is. And certainly you know, from my own personal practice, it's really useful to have people who are really good at that sort of articulating or visualizing really well what something might look like over a significant period of time, you know, sort of 30 plus years, to help people understand what the options are and what the choices are. So I think that's something that, again, you know, that going back to how we embed this sort of science and evidence-based approach into our practice, we need to have the science and the evidence base, but we also need to kind of be a bit more artistic, perhaps, in our in the way that we explore or demonstrate or kind of articulate the potential outcomes of the choices that we make now.
comment on that, if that's fine. I absolutely agree with you, Dan. I think in the past I've seen the impact sort of when I was with, for example, the Environment Agency and the flood risk programs. And it can be very difficult to get communities to accept or even to really just take note of the flood risk around which they're in their area. But visualization really does help, and of course now we're a lot more sophisticated in our software techniques, and we can, certainly the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, the Impact Protection agencies can show the impact of a change of from a 1 in 1,000 year event or a 1 in 400 year event, now moving down to a 1 in 400 years, now 1 in 200 year, and so on, and what that would mean to somebody if that event happened. You know, would the water reach their level? That also is a very good vehicle for getting people to discuss risk assessment. You know, indeed, I have a cousin who bought a house in an area many years ago, which was 1 in 400 year flood risk area, and she was flooded within 2 weeks of moving in, and she was furious with me, saying, you know, it was 1 in 400 year, and as a general, you know, intelligent woman, but not in science or technical field, and just has never really thought about it. So taking it back to the visualization, I think that's really important, and that the ability to literally give people visualizations of changes in their landscapes with different interventions and nature-based solutions that Liz mentioned. For example, all the development of a new renewables site, what that would mean in the landscape helps communities explore that and articulate their concerns. So again, yes, I mean, in this institution, I would think a lot of professionals would be either using it or would very much like to use those sorts of techniques. They're extremely good, I think, for bringing people around to discuss all the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're really important. And as you say, that what we're able to do now with some of that technology is absolutely fantastic and really helps to communicate what the potential or what the potential impact is of something. But I think you know, that's greater to kind of a landscape scale. Well, the other thing, you know, because some of the things we're talking about are going to be a much smaller scale and much more sort of affect people much more personally on a more day-to-day level, and thinking about how we communicate what those interventions might look like is really important. That's not something that I have particular expertise in, but you know, what would the implications be of you know, something like transport related, you know, separate more public transport or a change to electric vehicles or whatever it might be? What does that actually look like for you as an individual on a day-to-day basis? And it's really interesting because I think the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything really changed how people thought about how life was possible to be lived. You know, we're all now sat at home doing this via Zoom rather than in a room somewhere together. And you know, and partly that's enabled by technology, but it made people realize that actually another way is possible. That sounds, you know, it's a bit of a theatrical phrase, but you know, it made people realize that they could still carry on living their lives in ways that they hadn't previously considered. And I think that's it's actually going to be really a valuable experience for everybody to say, okay, you went through a big change and you still came out the other end of it. I mean, I know lots of people are affected very badly by it, but and those are the things we need to address. But actually, maybe that makes those systematic changes less terrifying for people because they've had to do something for reasons they didn't want to, but maybe they might be more willing to do something that means something like this isn't going to have the quite same impact on them in the future. So yeah, thinking about how that works at a micro scale and a personal level, I think is also really important.
So my briefing for today was that I was to make it feel like a chat in the pub, which I think we definitely have, but to stretch the metaphor a little further, the last orders bell is most definitely ringing, and our staff are starting to cast evils in our direction. So I do want us to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. One of the outputs from this work is that we'll be drawing all of it together in what we're calling internally. I don't know if it would be called that externally yet, but our manifesto for transformative change. And reflecting on today's conversation, I just wanted 2 minutes from each of you about what you think, not necessarily a big idea, but a kind of a strong theme within that manifesto should be. And that could just be an approach rather than a particular idea. So just to capture something for today, I'm trying to look who looks like they're thinking less and have got an idea. Liz, I'm going to go with you first.
I can't turn my mic off. Yeah, my big thing would be do it in partnership. That's absolutely crucial, because otherwise it won't work. You'll just head off in a direction, you'll look behind and nobody will be there with you. It has to be in partnership.
I think I'm going to come back to that point we were making last about really trying to communicate what the future might look like in ways that are very real for individuals and communities. Because I think if we can do that well, then I think by using that partnership approach, as you say, Liz, that people will be more willing to take that step forward because they sort of know where they're heading and what the future might look like. So I think that visualization, sort of future postcards from the future type approach is something that we should all get better at doing.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with both of those. That's great. And I suppose then my third, because I didn't quite know what we were going to do, but I'd written sort of just to prompt myself to remember the systems thinking, the co-production, and interdisciplinarity. And I think in the manifesto that I suppose interdisciplinarity almost has to be a bedrock of this institution, or it better be. So that's almost a sort of foregone conclusion that pulling together the different disciplines. However, I think sort of it is the Institution of Environmental Sciences, and we need to use environmental sciences in all its glory, not just the scientific sciences. It is environmental sciences today is truly interdisciplinary. So I hope we've got members from the arts and humanities, and that we do celebrate their input, because it particularly maps back to what Dan was talking about, the visualization and Liz and beliefs. But I popped that in, but my main thing would be the evidence synthesis, that the institution needs to take a strong stance on the rigor of the evidence and what it means, so that we don't just present the report, we don't just present the evidence, we present what our analyses indicate in terms of impact for effectiveness of interventions to help people. That culture is improving. We no longer just put a scientific report or an academic report on the table and expect the politicians to interpret it. We have to be the bridge, we have to be the interpreters of multiple options that are derived from that evidence.
Thank you. So today we've covered a lot of ground in a very wide-ranging discussion, but I think that was inevitable given the theme of today being the big picture, and it was a very difficult challenge to draw together what's amounted to a year's work. But I think you all rose very much to the challenge, and I thought that was a fascinating discussion. And hopefully we'll see some of that echoed in 9 days' time in the discussions that take place in COP and the negotiations, and whatever comes out the other end of it. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to catching up with you all again soon.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.